Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you all. And there's a lot to talk about, isn't there? Where do we start?
Indeed.
Yeah, I'll tell you where I'll start. I was looking at, obsessively as one does, at my X feed today. And someone pointed out that the Oval Office now looks like an office in the Kremlin. And they're absolutely right. I mean, he's put every picture he could get his hands on of a former president on the walls. And there's a lot of sort of
As long
gold.
as they're gilded frames.
There's a lot of gilded stuff. And I remember I've done more documentaries about Trump than I could possibly admit to. And I once interviewed his butler, who worked for him in Mar-a-Lago for 25 years, and went from that to selling gilded mirrors in an antique shop in West Palm Beach. It was the perfect transition. And I said to him, does Donald like this? I said, oh, he loves the gold. He loves the mirrors. You know, that's all true. Anyway, let's get serious here. So it's not even 100 days. And yet, you know, as Lenin said, sometimes, you know, there are decades when nothing happens, and sometimes there are weeks when decades happen. We're in the kind of latter phase, aren't we, John?
We are, yeah. I think this is something we've talked about, but I think we're looking at nothing short of and I say this with a big caveat. Revolution sounds grandiloquent. This is a kind of cretinous uprising. You know, this is a revolution by reaction. And we're seeing it not only in the United States, we're seeing it in other countries that are trying to emulate what Trump is doing. And that's what's, I think, truly frightening. There is, of course, there's the pecuniary self-interest, which is evident in Trump and his family, the idea that they would launch crypto at the same time as attempt statecraft, to call it something. But this idea of going after diversity, I believe, I see it as a kind of rubric for white supremacy and misogyny turned into an ideology that, in turn, allows them to purge the federal government, universities, and to try to transform the country and its discourses. And we're seeing it happening with a certain amount of success. We saw, of course, Harvard kick back today. Let's see how that pans out. They're going to go after them on taxes. But by and large, we're seeing a kind of caving. I think people are afraid for the first time in the United States of their government, of what it can do. That fear is something I think that any of us that know Americans or have been in America before and now are seeing in different ways. Not least people who are afraid to speak out. There's this event here. I'm supposed to be at an event at the end of the month in Washington involving former senior State Department people. And there was about 10 who were supposed to be in this event. I'm moderating. And it's dropped to 6. And that's
indicative.
That's indicative of the fear. There actual is a fear. Not to mention the fear being felt by people from other countries, worried about what might happen when they land at JFK or Houston Airport when they arrive. So, long and anecdotal way of saying, yes, this is one of those latter episodes.
People have compared it to McCarthyism. But I wonder if this is happening on lots of different levels. I mean, McCarthyism was a very specific thing against a specific crowd of people. But this seems to be an assault on the alliances that have kept America and the rest of the West safe, an assault on the institutions of the federal government, an assault on the law and lawyers and law firms, specifically named in presidential orders, which is extraordinary. An assault on, you know, aspects of freedom of speech, on academia. It's everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah, exactly. I think an early indication, actually, people have all kinds of theories about this, but right after the inauguration, one of the first agencies they went after was USAID, which is a United States Agency for International Development, and an arm of the United States Department of State since 1961, I think. The soft power arm, with a budget, I think, of around $80 billion a year. These were the people that handed out retrovirals in Africa. They did some bad stuff along the way, but mostly on the last 4 years under Samantha Power, and at other times did some pretty good stuff too. At any case, this was the first agency that was targeted by Doge, by Musk, and by Trump. And they didn't just advise this agency that they were going to be phased out or they were going to have a reduction in staff. They sent over a crew of people to literally just jackhammer off their etched in, their plaque on the stone facade of the building, which they've also done for the United States Institute of Peace, another soft power arm of the State Department, which Trump, of course, has always seen as a bastion of liberals. And we've just learned today that there's a memo circulating in Washington in which Trump calls for a reduction. The next budget for the State Department will be half of what it is today. So we're looking at a very targeted approach, and these career diplomats, career public servants have been targeted in a way with overt hostility. It's a purge. It's a purge. It's not a Stalinist purge. They weren't hauled off and shot that night. But in 2025, the idea that you would begin with a jackhammer on the building and then lock people out of their houses, out of their offices, is pretty shocking. And a number of people have theories about that one. Why USID? Because the average American didn't really know about USID. If you were living abroad, if you were in the NGO world or UN or a journalist, diplomat, you would know about USID. But the average person in, Ohio or North Carolina wouldn't have heard of it. The idea perhaps being, start with the low-hanging fruit where you're not going to get any kickback and then go on. And now we're seeing it right across the board. So I think we're in the early days of nothing less than a revolution by reaction. I don't know what else to call it. A reactionary takeover. I was thinking on the train today coming up, actually, Matt, about the Iranian Revolution, 1979. Of course, the two societies are very different, but in thinking of it in terms of, is this a revolution? And Iran in the 1970s was, of course, an unequal society, but in many ways, and of course, we all learned to vilify the Shah, not least because the secret police had a ghoulish acronym for SAVAK, it was straight out of a Bond movie. And they tortured people, and they killed people. But by comparison with what the Islamic, revolution has become in the last 45 years, the Shah looks fairly powder puffy almost. He was one of the biggest purchasers of Western arms in the world for the decade of the 70s. He was on the verge of being allowed to have nuclear weapons by the United States. 90,000 Americans worked and lived in Tehran, and at least as many Iranian students were at campuses in the United States. In other words, point being, it was part of the family of nations, and it was also an important balancing power to the Wahhabis in the Saudi, in the Arabian Gulf. All of that went out the window with the revolution. My point here is that another aspect of the Iranian Revolution, now, in power for the last 45 years, is that it very much has been an empowerment of the underclass based upon this idea of, a Leninist-style revolution. These people were living in these swanky palaces. Let's get rid of them. Let's kill them. And now the people are in charge. Well, of course, there's corruption in Iran, but the people have sort of been in charge. And one of the strongest arms of the Iranian Revolution isn't even its revolutionary armed forces, the Revolutionary Guards. It's the Basiji, the paramilitary arm, these stubble-chinned guys in civilian clothes who can be relied upon to come out and beat girls if they take their hijab off, or beat students if they demand civic freedoms. And that is where I see an equivalence in what's happening in the United States.
When you see these masked officers from ICE arresting students,
but also,
as they did just yesterday.
But also the conspiracy
Yeah.
theories that are now becoming part of the official worldview.
But I wonder to what extent, I was just back in from Washington. I've been there 4 or 5 times just in the last few months. And there are some people, of course, who think that this is the end of the Republic as they know it, or certainly that the Republic is in peril. But there are many other people I know who really don't like Trump very much at all, who are saying, don't overreact. This is, look at the first term, it wasn't that bad, this will pass. And I wonder to what extent America has become kind of ensnared, fooled by its own sense of exceptionalism. Exceptionalism is a dangerous thing. You think that something that's happened to other countries can never happen to you. Yes. And then you look at the evidence and you point out the people being lifted and the institutions being ransacked and eviscerated. And you say, but hang on, this reminds me of lots of other places, as you just said. Yeah. And I think, what is the thing that needs to happen for those Americans who don't get it to get it? And will it be too late?
I think there's a real danger in it being too late, because I do think you're right. I think the Americans, I was raised by a progressive foreign service officer who happened to work for USAID and the Peace Corps Kennedy creations, JFK creations, and who nonetheless felt that he had the freedom and the right to take us as children and march on Nixon's White House against Nixon and against the Vietnam War as a public servant without any fear of any kind of reaction, and there wasn't. I think that will be changing today, but we're not there yet. I think, let's see what happens with Harvard. Let's see what happens with this standoff with the federal courts, and even the Supreme Court over this deportee, this fellow that they wrongly deported, and now we're just saying we're not going to return him. If more and more, it's a country that's very litigious, as you know. Much more than, say, Britain. Everybody's a lawyer and everybody's getting sued in the States. And there is a long and a fierce tradition of defending the rule of law. We know that Trump will bend every corner, will stomp on the law if he can. I'm unclear exactly at what point Americans will react. Will it react when they see not just children in those cages on the border, but tens of thousands of people in deportation camps? I'm not sure. These will be foreigners. They've been worked for a long time, that these people are all gang members, that first they were stealing our jobs, then they were rapists and thieves and murderers, and now they're members of criminal gangs. Barbarians, Trump calls them.
But it's possible that we'll get a coalition of some sort of resistance coalition, if that's the right word, from lots of unsolicited and surprising corners. So you've got the lawyers. This is the optimistic scenario, right? So the lawyers in Washington who've been, excluded from business with the government might find a law firm that will represent them. I think that's already happening. You've got the judges doing what judges are supposed to do. You've got the Supreme Court, at least some of the justices, including Justice Roberts, the Chief Supreme Court Justice, bringing out his inner lawyer rather than his inner Trump, fan. This is small stuff. You then combine that with farmers in the Midwest who can't sell their grain to USAID anymore because the agencies cease to exist. Inflation possibly going up if the trade war is as bad as we think it might get, especially with China. There will be pockets of resistance. And one has to remember that he didn't win by a landslide, although he likes to say that he did. And the MAGA base, the true believers, the cult, is at best 30% of the electorate. So there is hope there. There is hope there. You don't seem convinced.
No, there's hope. There's hope, but I'm concerned.
Yeah, we're all
because
concerned.
Here we are watching a man who, despite the fact that he did what he did, despite the fact that he's arguably a criminal in legal terms, got back into power with enough of the electorate to legally sit in the White House again, and begin to say that the January 6th event was a lie, was a monstrous lie, and that the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th were hostages of the system. This idea of this transmogrification of semantics, this, unfortunately, if you go out, and you have, you know what I'm talking about. If you leave Washington, if you leave New York, and not very far even, you find people that do believe, cling to these conspiracy theories. And one thing I've found throughout my life is that, and at first I was surprised by this, is that even in the age of mass information, prior to the internet, there was BBC World Service. I mean, you could be in a tyrannical country and still secretly listen to the truth, perhaps, right? But what I did find in a few of these places where I found tyrannies overturned, and I'm thinking of Saddam's Iraq in 2003 right now, I realized that a lot of people preferred to believe what they were being told, even though at some level intellectually they must have realized they were being talked down to, they were being lied to by their dictator. They didn't dare think anything else, because the consequences were, in the case of Saddam's Iraq, were death. He even went so far as to decree amputation of the tongue if you talked against him or his family. It was an actual decree law at one point. But that's how far it went eventually. So the fear there, of course, was on a monstrous scale.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, what I found was that very few people really knew the truth. And I found this in the West as well. Cuba is a country I know a lot, quite well. I lived there at one point. I had friends there. Most are either gone or dead. But there was a young woman, younger than me, who I revisited on a trip back, I think 2005, let's say. And I went to see her, and she was in her 30s, educated, and we were having dinner, and she said, it's terrible what's going on in Afghanistan, isn't it? And I was thinking, I thought she meant Iraq, and I said, what do you mean? I said, yeah, and she had this version of what was going on at the time. We can all criticize, but her version was a concocted conspiracy theory that was very much out of, Central Committee propaganda, DOR, the Department of Revolutionary Orientation. It was not what was really happening in Afghanistan. And I was shocked that she, having the ability, she'd been US educated but chose to live in Cuba. She was on the left, but she chose to believe this other version, which was the opposite, the actual more accurate shading of the truth was freely available, and yet she chose to believe a particular tranche of the news. I ran across it for the very first time in the United States in 2009 in Tennessee. I was in the point about this kind of anecdotal riff is that I fear the contagion and the power of contagion of conspiracy theories wielded by a cult-like figure, which is how I've begun to see Trump. And so I was in a hospital pharmacy in Dixon, Tennessee, 40 minutes from Nashville. I had to get some medicine. I was waiting there at the counter. There was a TV on, as there are in so many places, up on the wall. The sound was down. And it was the primaries between Obama and Hillary Clinton. He hadn't been chosen yet as the Democratic candidate in 2008. But you could see the split screen. There was Hillary, there was Obama. And this fellow looked like a farmer type, cute little boy with him looking at, and he announced to me, the pharmacist, the friend with me in this space, said, "That guy is a Muslim," pointing to Obama. And I saw his little boy, I'll never forget that little boy, looked like Andy of Mayberry, from the blonde kid, cute little kid looking up at his dad. And I thought, Jesus, what am I going to say here? They're going to think I'm some kind of, Yankee, liberal, whatever, carpetbagger. So I waited a minute, and then I said, I don't think so. I mean, actually, I think he's a Christian. He has a funny name, but actually, he's a Christian. He said, nah, I heard it on Fox. And eventually he was waiting for medicine, left, and I talked to the pharmacist, who turned out to be a local boy. He'd been to New York, come back. He said, yeah, everybody around here thinks like that. You'd be surprised.
Well, Trump's butler, who I interviewed, as I told you earlier, I said to him at the end, what about Obama? And he said, well, as he was speaking as an interior designer, I hate what they've done to the White House. So what have they done to the White House? He said, well, they put prayer rugs everywhere. What do you mean prayer rugs? Muslim prayer rugs on the walls. I said, well, have you been to the White House? Have you seen the prayer rugs? Of course he hadn't seen them. But this ability to believe stuff that is blatantly wrong means that the combination of tribal politics, polarization, and the internet, and especially in America, you can live in a community of Democrats and Republicans without ever meeting someone from the other side. Space is both a blessing and a curse in that sense. But it means that we've gone back to literally the Middle Ages in terms of what people believe. People in that village believe that people in that village over there, they're all witches. Yeah. So again, this is a depressing reality. Is that what are the kind of neutral institutions, whether it's in the media or elsewhere, that people from both sides can agree on? When you have a president who lies, who makes up his own set of facts, who defies eyesight by saying my crowd was bigger than the other guy's crowd when it clearly wasn't. You're in a. I'm amazed that it didn't come to blows in the election. I mean, we all assumed that the election would be a sort of a hanging chad, as it were. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, it's a blessing that it wasn't, that he won the election. But in many other ways, it's not, because he's able to do all the things he's been able to do.
Well, and he's undermining, there's a full-fledged attack now on the cultural institutions. Yeah. I happen to mention diplomacy, but the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian, the universities, this is scary stuff. This has never really happened before, and that's what's worrying. And so I talked about what and I'm not kidding when I say I genuinely think of it as a cretinous uprising. It's the revolt of the cretins, and I'm sorry, cretins, but that's how I feel about you. I think Hillary was pulling her punches when she called them deplorable. It may have cost her the election, but actually, if you are that malevolent in your thinking about others, if you're willing to purge women and blacks from the military, from every government department, because on the basis that they likely got their position because they were somehow favored by reverse discrimination, that's odious, and it's white supremacy and misogyny dressed up with an excuse, a rubric that's a shield for what you're really doing, and we know that that's the case because he's also, the position he took on the whole issue of the Confederacy. We're inviting white Afrikaners, those poor white Afrikaners, to come to the United States. We're deporting brown and black people. They're even going to deport people back to Haiti, which is about to be taken over by the gangs. But we're going to invite in these poor white farmers from Boers from South Africa.
But I wonder if the particular genius, the kind of evil genius, if you like, of this administration is that they're not doing these things on the sly. They're not doing them, programmatically. They're doing them performatively. Everything they do is for the cameras, partly for the ratings, and he's obsessed with ratings, but also it's for the cameras because people like us, people like you, will get outraged by it. And in that sense, it's different to any other kind of creeping despotism, because it's weaponizing, a democracy in a divided nation against the people who are just about the minority.
Sure, and I think in Trump, you're right, and I think in Trump's first term, all of us, the shock and awe has kicked in now, right? We realize, okay, they're serious. Plus, he's left the adults in the room out of the room, and he's brought in his crowd, his Hegseth and these sorts of dunderheads. But what I think where we erred in responding in Trump 1.0 was in believing that when he made a joke about stuff, that it was a joke. You know, he's charismatic. He likes to crack jokes. He does it now too. You know, he's buffoonish. The hair. Yeah. We were all fixated on the ridiculousness of his hair and his sunbed tan and all that stuff. But actually, I've thought about it. A lot of despots were buffoonish in the beginning. Mussolini, Hitler.
Karl Kraus, the Austrian satirist, said about Hitler, he does his own satire. You know, undermines. You know, it undermines what I do.
Yeah.
And Trump is the same.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity of meeting a few of the wannabe, Trumpians. The most maybe famous right now being Javier Milei of Argentina, who adores Trump and adores Musk and wants to do everything just like they do. But also, he's the one who gave Musk the chainsaw. In fact, when I met him September, he was claiming, and the people around him were claiming, that what he was doing to the federal government, ripping the state apart, because it was full of fat from the communist paranists who'd run the country into the ground, and they were corrupt, and they did have a lardy government, but nonetheless, he's a narco-capitalist and wants essentially there to be no state. So he was firing people right and left. He'd eliminated half of the government ministries and so on. He said, I've told Musk and Trump that they should do what we do. And that's kind of what they're doing. At the time I thought, he's giving himself too much credit. But as it turned out, it's kind of what they're doing, right down to the chainsaw.
It is performative. So if
it
you
is
look
performative.
At the Doge website, they claim to have saved, X number of billions, and actually they just haven't. I mean, they got the numbers. In one case, they said we've saved $8 billion, and they got the digits wrong. It was 8 million that they'd saved. So there's an awful lot of incompetence there, and I think maybe incompetence is ultimately what will undo them, because different to other countries that are dealing with these kind of creeping forms of despotism. There are a lot of smart people in America. Some of them are afraid at the moment, but there are some, smart and rich institutions. And I think the canary in the coal mine, as you mentioned earlier, will be the universities and the courts.
Yes.
And sadly, the Democrats are slowly getting their act together. Yeah. They're becoming, they've got a spine, and they're beginning to, let it sing. The Republicans are the party that really upsets me, because this is a party that has been taken over by Trump, who's not even a ideological Republican. The party of Lincoln has been fundamentally humiliated, and in the greed for power, in the belief that he is the winning ticket, has allowed themselves to be co-opted like this. Yeah. I wonder at what stage little Marco Rubio discovers that he has, some Cuban pride and a spine, and will stand up to the boss and resign. I doubt it, frankly, at the moment.
It looks like he doesn't have any, or it disappeared up an orifice. And I say that because just yesterday I was reading, like I said, I follow what's happening in Cuba. Cuba is really close to the edge. It's lost more people in the past 3 years than in the entire revolution. About 18% of the population, over 1 million people, about 500,000 have settled in South Florida, and they're slated for deportation. For the first time in the history of this Cold War relationship, this government, with Marco Rubio, Cuban-American, and another guy even further to the right than him, who's the special envoy to the region, a guy called Claver Caron, very right-wing, appear to be going along with this idea of deporting up to 500,000 Cubans. Now, either they have a plan to completely destabilize the island by beginning to deport, because I don't know that they could get to deport that many. It's a lot. But if they were to deport 50,000, it would be a hugely destabilizing influence on the island. And there's also talk and calls for them to cut remittances to the island, which, by the way, it's not only Cuba. A lot of the region depends on remittance income from their migrants in the United States, who, by the way, do all of the service, all of the labor that, white Americans don't want to do. So at a certain point, something's going to give. And if they do that, it could well be the end of the Cuban Revolution, but it will also bring, God knows how many Cubans on rafts to Florida, just as it happened many times before in the past.
But it's also possible that if he overplays that hand, that those Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans, who were all massive Trump supporters, I met many of them in Florida before the election, that they will say, hang on a minute, you broke your promises. My auntie's been deported back to Caracas. People have been sent back to, and you said that would never happen with us. And it did, because everyone interprets the message in their own, they see it through the prism of their own experience. And I think, so you lose Florida, you might lose Michigan because of the farming communities, and because you haven't brought those jobs back to the auto workers as before, as you promised to do with the tariffs. So the question really is, the Democrats look at the midterm elections in a year and a half as the savior of all their problems. That may be misguided, because you've got to do more than just wait for that date to happen. But that is a date that is coming down the pipe. And unless he completely overturns the democratic system and cancels the elections, which I wouldn't put it past him to try or to think about it. Mm-hmm. At the moment, we're not there yet, as you said earlier. So there is, there are still checks and balances in the system, and I just wonder if the trap that we're really falling into, all of us here, is fatalism.
Yeah. Like I said, well, I think there's a sense of thrall. I think there's a sense of shock. Mm. I don't know about fatalism. I think, of course, as you rightly pointed out, there's beginning to be reactions, and I think we've all had this cognitive dissonance about why isn't anybody doing anything? And of course, they started actually pretty quickly. Bernie Sanders and Teresa Ocasio-Cortez, barnstorming across the country. We saw. What's his name? The New Jersey Senator Cory Booker the other day do this 25-hour marathon speech as an effort to galvanize attention to what was going on. Others, Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut. I fear that someone like Chris Murphy, as well spoken as he is and articulate and right-minded, nonetheless is speaking to the convinced. But so you need more of it happening out there, like you pointed out, the Michigan farmers and so on. Let's see. But you're right. And now there's some demonstrations taking place across the country, and this happened just this last week.
What's so interesting is that, so I don't know if you remember the inauguration, you had 5 living presidents sitting there, right? So he was insulting them, not by name, but by inference. He was insulting one after another, more or less his version, the new version of American carnage. These guys have, reaped disaster on the country, and now I'm the savior. I mean, I was, the sort of lurid side of my imagination was hoping that they would all just get up and walk out. Yeah. But that's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a big debate about that. To what extent, is the office of the president, which is invested with such deference, even from people who don't like the particular occupant, there's such deference also from presidents towards each other. Yeah. The fetishization of this office is a massive issue in American politics. That they somehow thought that even though they've been insulted, they cannot get up and walk out of that ceremony. And more importantly, now that we've seen what Trump has actually been doing, I've not heard one of them, apart from Obama, very quietly at a university gathering say something. I want to hear George W. Bush, who hates Donald Trump. Yeah. I know that for a fact. He hates him. He can't stand him. He thinks he's destroying the Republican brand. Where is George W.? Where is Dick Cheney? His daughters are the crosshairs. Yeah. Where's Dick Cheney, for Christ's sake? These are the people you want to hear. But I suspect that partly they don't, because they're obsessed with, not doing the wrong thing if one president doesn't criticize another president. And they're afraid that if they speak out, it'll somehow embolden the pro-Trump crowd. And that's getting back to that problem of democracy. You feel, in a dictatorship, you say, right, I'm on the barricades. I'm opposed to this guy. He's a dictator. Shoot me if you want. But they somehow think that they have to play the 3-dimensional chess of public opinion politics, and that's a problem.
Or is it even fear from them? Because, it's sort of underbrush news, but he's taken away their intelligence briefings. This has never been, it's been done before by Biden to Trump after January 6th. He took away his, But he's stripped them of, and he's also stripped other, not the presidents, but others, former senior officials of their Secret Service protection. This has never been done before. So there's, I think, real fear.
But hang on a minute. I've spoken a lot to John Bolton recently. I never thought that John Bolton would become the, the paragon of
Abraham Lincoln.
the the Abraham Lincoln of today. But there he is. And he's happy to speak out about Trump. He's incredibly rude about him. Quite funny. Yeah. I spoke to Fiona Hill last week, who's a Brit, but a naturalized American, American husband, American daughter going to college. And she was quiet for a few months. I think she was afraid. And she was very vocal before the election. Now she's come out and she said, this matters too much for me to stay quiet. If Fiona Hill and John Bolton, and they both had their intelligence, access taken away, but I think John Bolton actually had, I think he had security at one stage. That's gone.
That's
Fiona
gone.
never had that. But if they can speak out, then for goodness sake, Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, Messiah's former presidents, let's hear from you. I'm sure they're listening, by the way.
Just stepping out of
There he is. He's coming in. Yeah.
stepping outside of the U.S. for a moment to the region, Latin America, where I spend quite a bit of time. I was there recently, and so I know a few of the leaders, including one or two of the Trumpians, and those who are not. Lula comes to mind, whom I saw 2 weeks ago. He said to me, "What's Obama doing?
Yeah.
Why isn't he speaking out? He's still young.
Yes.
Where's Obama?" And he was genuinely worried. Lula is a guy who, he's an emotional kind of creature. You know when he's worried, you know when he's happy, you know when he's sad, you know when he's afraid. And this time he was assertive, he was looking good, healthy, but he was seriously worried about Trump and what's happening and what's being done, as are a few others. Now, there's very few willing to speak out. I was impressed by Lula's willingness to go on the record, because until now, curiously, Trump, Musk, and that crowd, other than their support for Bolsonaro, which is insidious and serious, haven't really gone head-to-head and tried to attack Lula, although they think he's a communist. This also was the day after Brazil also came under the steel tariffs. He took it in stride. But most of the leaders, just as happened in the Republican Party of the United States, and sadly with a lot of civic leaders as well, I'm thinking also about some university presidents and so on, they're trying to keep their heads down. They're terrified of what Trump might do to them. And as a case in point, Panama, which you'll remember he mentioned 3 times in his speech, his inaugural speech, along with territorial expansion and manifest destiny, right? He mentioned Panama 3 times, much to the shock of the Panamanians, who all this time thought, hey, we're good with the Americans. And by the way, Molino, the president, is a right-of-center guy, right? Former security chief. His boss was a scumbag, billionaire, just like Trump. So I think he thought he was fine. But all of a sudden, there's Trump saying, we're going to take back the canal. So in the back and forth that's gone on since then, of course, our attentions have shifted elsewhere, not the Panamanians. So last week, I got a hold of the 5 or 6 people I know who are quite well-placed people, because I realized I hadn't been hearing from them for about 2-3 weeks. And I said, what's up? Why aren't you talking to me? What's going on? They're all terrified. And they say that Molino, their president, is basically giving everything that Trump wants. Then you had the visit of Hegseth last week. Hegseth, this guy who does push-ups and the defense secretary.
The man who said in his hearing, I promise you, I will get over my drinking problem. I mean, which should be disqualifying.
Presumably that has a corollary with his, sex abuse of women. Anyway.
And the Nazi tattoos. Anyway,
and the Nazi tattoos. I don't know if he's gotten rid of those yet. But so there was a joint declaration. So there's been annual, joint maneuvers between these allied countries now for all these years, despite the fact that the U.S. gave over the canal 25 years ago, signed the treaty, et cetera, et cetera. And Hegseth went down for these maneuvers. And here and there are examples of, I think, what they're going to do with Panama. And this is something they may be planning to do elsewhere, possibly Greenland, which is a kind of creeping occupation or creeping takeover. And in the case of Panama, what they've done is they extended the military maneuvers, I think unilaterally. Molino, the president, the very fearful president, went along with it. Then they had a joint declaration before Hegseth returned to Washington. And it's been pointed out that there are two different versions of the joint declaration. The Panamanian declaration with a key line about Panamanian sovereignty, that line is missing from the English language American declaration. They're word for word except for that line. So they're sending a message. They want it to be known. It's obvious. And then Trump, separately, just in one of those jokey asides of his, said something like, we've got Panama sorted out. You know, the military are there. You know, something like that. They're going to be there. So this kind of extension of the maneuvers becomes a kind of permanent presence again, with a weak president who fears that if he doesn't go along with it, you know, it could get much worse, much more ugly. So we could be seeing that kind of behavior from this government in the region. And of course, it's the revival of the ugly Americanism, you know, which you know, existed in novel form 60 years ago. The book, The Ugly American and The Quiet American. And now we have it in a very kind of explicit, transactional feels a little too kind, but
it's too mild a term.
it's very bullying, and it will have real consequences, I fear, down the road.
I mean, just very briefly before we open up to questions, one of the secret weapons of this government, of this administration, is the jocularity, the unbearable lightness of Trump. And, you know, just when you're really ready to, you know, I mean, lots of Democrats hate him, but if you're a Republican, you're beginning to fear him. He makes a joke and you think, it's not that bad. He's just being funny. And briefly, just on the presidents, I mean, these are people who campaigned last year about the end of democracy.
Yeah.
And
fascism.
Yeah, they said, you know, I mean, Biden said it, sort of, Obama said it, Clinton said it, and where are they now? Now it's actually happening. I want to hear from them. Anyway, okay, let's open up to questions.
There's 2 questions at a
Miranda.
time.
Mike's coming.
Thank you very much, although that was very depressing, so I don't know if I should be
We're
thanking
going to
you.
try and cheer you up. Not.
But Matt, you said that will it be sheer incompetence that brings them down? And we haven't really talked about the tariffs and a potential looming recession. So could you maybe develop a little bit on that? And do you think it'll happen? And will that be his undoing? I mean, should we be looking forward to a recession now as a way of getting rid of him?
Look, I'm not an economist, and frankly, I don't trust many economists because look at the state of the economy and the recession we had, and so on and so on. Trump is playing with the world's economy at the moment, feeling his power, and I think kind of what you see is what you'll get. He will tighten, adjust, and make jokes and do things accordingly. Could he make a misstep and cause a recession, as some have said? Or let's see, China has just canceled its Boeing orders. Could this be a very serious beginning where the pain is truly felt in a key sector in the United States? It was almost that on the bonds the other day.
Yeah, I think
We don't know yet.
Yeah.
We don't know yet.
No, the bonds are crucial. The reaction of the bonds was important. They seem to have come down a little bit. But I think what people on Wall Street experienced, which they hadn't expected, was a real glimpse of the abyss. And once you've lost the trust of the world, you know, the world's financial community, of the world's bankers, of big corporations, because you change your mind on a daily basis about what kind of tariffs you want to impose, you know, you can't regain that trust very easily. But again, what's amazing is that you talk to pro-Trump people and they say, this guy's a genius, it's the vintage out of the deal, look at all these phone calls that have been made by countries like the UK and others begging for something. And that's the way that side of the argument will remember it. But if these things get worse, and there's massive peril here, and the bonds go seriously wobbly again, then suddenly, you will find that the system could be fundamentally undermined. And there's one interesting calculation here. So America has debts of, $3.8 trillion or something. That debt is held first of all by Japan, then by China, and then by the UK. These are the three biggest owners of American treasuries. We call them gilts, bonds. The Chinese could totally destroy the American system if they wanted to by selling all these treasuries. Now, that would undermine them as well, because if you flog that stuff, obviously the price goes down and you're in trouble yourself. But if you push them to a point, and they have an amazing threshold of pain compared to America, where they are prepared to shoot themselves in one foot in order to shoot you in both of yours, I wouldn't put that past them. And I think, we got to a stage last week where, I'm told by friends who know this better than I do that the Chinese were going through these different calculations. And then on the other side, you've got, the American, the guy who's got the small business, selling Barbie dolls and, the equivalent of Toys R Us or whatever still exists out there. They will find it incredibly difficult to keep their businesses going. And they will go to the wall if this isn't fixed. And don't underestimate the ripple effect of that kind of economic fallout.
There's a kind of unquantifiable ingredient here, which I think goes back to what we've been talking about, is this cultish quality that Trump seems to have, where he managed to somehow hijack the Republican Party and a hell of a lot of the electorate. And I've seen this with some of his clones, like Javier Milei. Kind of doesn't matter what they say, as long as it goes viral on social media. And so that's the new virility, that's the new virtue in politics. You can say whatever you want, but if you get enough hits, enough likes, that's what you're looking for. And that's kind of where we're at. And something, I have a young friend, I saw him a couple of weeks ago in New York. Now, you've met Trump, I haven't, but he's been doing these portraits of all kinds of people. And he confessed over lunch that he had taken the portrait of Vance, whom he really disliked. And I think what you see is what you get with Vance. He's a pretty odious character. But when it came to Trump, he said, the guy really owned the room. He has amazing charisma. I said, are you serious? He said, look, he says, not the charisma where I'm going to go vote for him, but yeah, he took over the room. The first thing he did was he came in and he said, he walked right up to him, very close to him, and said, I hear you're the best photographer in the world. Then he called out to his aides and said, this kid's the best photographer in the world. What do you want me? And blah, blah, blah. And all that sounds fairly puerile, but he was remarking on it as a fairly sophisticated 30-something. And it made me, ever since then, I've been thinking, okay, so it's a cultish thing that he's got. You see these faces of people in his rallies, and they're looking at him like he's the Bhagwan or, I don't know, Taylor Swift or something, right? It's a cult.
I thought he was Taylor Swift. I think
so
another question.
that is where the calculation of what's bad for me in the economy might have a bit more room to go.
Ed.
You've been speaking about institutions mostly and the economy. One hopes that institutions, hope doesn't come easy to me, but one hopes that institutions might survive over time if the will is there. But the one thing that cannot survive is what gets called rather stupidly the environment, ergo nature.
Sorry, say that again.
The environment, nature.
Yeah.
Thank you for your sort of, reminding us about Ocasio-Cortez, Sanders, the demonstrations, the resistance of the federal judges. Actually, there is something uniquely American about this. It's not happening anywhere else. The opposition in America is actually in pretty good nick, ironically. But where can the resistance come to what's going to hit? To drill, baby, drill. The conditions for the federal aid for the fires in LA is one of them is abolish the California Coastal Commission. Well, that's the last few bits of coastline gone. Where does the resistance that you're talking about in terms of institutions come when it comes to the environment
I think
and
we
nature?
talked about I think the judges certainly are providing some resistance, and all that will percolate up towards the Supreme Court. You know, the Supreme Court ruled against the administration the other day and was ignored by the administration. This, you know, goes back to Andrew Jackson, who famously fell out with the Supreme Court, was it in 1842, and he turned around to them and said, I've got more or less, I've got an army, what do you have, right? Yeah. So the Supreme Court is important because they may not want to pick that many fights, because that will unmask the fact that they don't actually have that much real power. And in a system where all these other niceties of power, constitutional power, you know, the legacy, custom, you know, the actual application of the law, once it's down to raw power, you know, who's got more people in uniform to knock heads together, then you're in a different ballgame. We're not there yet. No. But I would look at the judges. I would continue to look at the media, not all of it, but some of it. I would look at the universities, because they, although people say universities, of course, the students and professors are always getting upset. But if the universities of the United States, and they're already doing it, stand together.
But not on the environment.
No, but hold on. But we'll get to that. And then what you need. I mean, it's possible that when you're so neglectful of so many things, that something could go horribly wrong, right? So either some big air crash, like the one in Reagan, but worse, blamed on DEI, which of course is complete nonsense, or another LA fire, blamed on someone or not dealt with in the right way. I remember I covered Hurricane Katrina. That was more damaging for the Bush administration than the Iraq War, right? Yeah. So, and remember, this would come at the same time as lots of other things have been happening. So don't underestimate the possibility for shit to happen, that is bad for the Trump crowd. And the other direction too. But I think it's a pathetic hope to cling on to. But it is a hope.
Yeah, they're deregulating so many things at the moment, a lot of them in the area of science and environment, that something could happen, in which case it becomes obvious. Maybe it is a Katrina, or maybe it's a storm that, because they've gotten rid of the storm advanced warning systems, it hits and causes huge damage, whatever. But I don't know. I don't know yet.
It's a terrible
we're still
hope,
only 86
terrible.
days in.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Incredible.
But I do think that people understand when they see something awful that's happened. Yeah. And Trump is very bad at keeping his mouth shut when he should. That he'll say something stupid, as he did, after the crash at Reagan Airport. People kind of think, hang on a minute, So look, the cult element is always there, but that is not enough to sustain him in power. The people I'm more worried about are the people in the middle who sort of swung to his side because either they think he's funny or he's not that bad, or they're making money out of him, or they think it's about time we got rid of all these bureaucrats, all that nonsense. Yeah. But that's the squishy bit in the middle that can turn against him. Next question. Yes, lady in the front. You need a microphone. Here. It's coming. Okay, here we go.
Thank you very much. The question that I want to raise is about what Trump has been able to play around with the tariffs. And one of the things that came to mind, particularly with China and all the imports to the United States and China, doesn't matter whether it's your iPhone, your iPad, or your Barbie doll that used to cost $20 and is now going to cost $45. So where is the rumble going to come? What is the next assault front on Trump that's saying, hang on, all these MAGA supporters and lovers, when it's the economy, baby, that is going to hit them between the eggs?
You pick a fight with Barbie at your peril, right?
Well, that's the point.
But also remember, so if you're at the Barbie end of things, if you're on the Barbie coalface, and you've got that toy shop, and there was a fantastic podcast on The Daily the other day about a woman who had a small shop that produced a kind of some sort of baby mat that prevents baby toys from falling off the mat. And she was in tears at the end of it. She was a former military woman, set up this business, and the business is going to go bust if these tariffs go ahead. Meanwhile, Apple, and Dell and other computer makers who are making their stuff in China, as we know, are exempt from these tariffs. Because he understands that. Yeah. So again, one of the geniuses of Trump's election is to turn, the people against the so-called elites, right? Now, the Barbie versus Apple fight is a classic people versus elite fight. If I was advising Trump, and I'm sure that he's listening, as I said, I would say be very careful what you do here, because at the end of the day, if you're seen to be on the side of the big corporations and you neglect the little guy who's trying to make a business, then we're always talking about small businesses. This is the bedrock of America. If you upset them too much and they can't sell their stuff, you will pay for it at the ballot box.
Hi there. I was wondering if you can speak to what you see to be the political endgame of this administration, because it seems to me that a lot of the actions that you alluded to, empowerment of the underclass, erosion of the so-called deep state, these seem to me to be much more tactical or performative, as you said, rather than anything strategigic.
Well, I think let's wait and see. I mean, this is very early days, and we could be, who knows, right? So we could be in a massive conflagration, an actual shooting war with China, in 2 years' time. I wouldn't rule that out. The whole thing with Russia could turn, against Russia from the Trump side. I mean, we just don't know. I don't think he wants a war. I genuinely think that he doesn't want a war. He doesn't like these kind of foreign adventures because they could go horribly wrong. But I think if he's desperate, he might want to pick a fight with someone, maybe a lesser country, and then maybe think that will create a sort of Falklands effect or something. Who knows? We don't know. We don't know what state the economy will be in a year's time. It's possible that in 90 days' time, he will have cancelled most of the tariffs against the countries that they were imposed against. We just don't know that. But what we do know is that he's obsessed with attention. He is narcissistic. He wants to go down in history as a great president. And that narcissism, that vanity, that is something that people can use against him if you're negotiating with him.
Yeah, there's another aspect to this, which is that there are at the moment two extremely important international conflicts, armed conflicts raging, in which in the one, he appears to be switching sides at the expense of NATO and the EU. By the way, NATO and the UN also, apparently, according to this memo, are to have their budgets slashed almost completely. So the US will cease to be a contributor or remain only a symbolic contributor. Think of that. So there's the Russia-Ukraine one, and then there's the one in Israel and Gaza and the Middle East, which is, by the way, experiencing a realignment as we speak, that we don't know exactly which way it's going to go, with the knock-on effects in Syria, Iraq, and Iran. I was in Syria not that long ago, and the expectation is that the West, led by Israel, but of course in league with the United States and its immediate allies, will attack Iran sometime soon because of the possibility that they will acquire nuclear weapons. I also tend to believe that will happen, probably, because I don't think Trump is capable of actually securing a deal with Iran. And why would they give up their ace in the sleeve at this point? So that could well provide one of these conflicts, which he may want to be a peacemaker, but in fact he's riding the bucking bronco with his relationship with Netanyahu. Doesn't seem to know what to do in the swirl of Syria, and is very much Netanyahu-led when it comes to what to do about Iran. So, again, watch that space. Nobody's talking about it right now, but I do think it's a serious one, and that could well be the war that happens on his watch.
I wonder so apparently when Netanyahu was in Washington last week, he was disappointed that Trump wanted to go ahead with these negotiations with Tehran, which took place at the weekend in Oman, because maybe he wanted to ensnare Trump into a regime change scenario. But he may not be disappointed for that long, because Trump's condition for these talks is that Iran has to give up all its nuclear eggs in the basket. They're not going to do that. They know even more than they did before that this is the only protection they really have. And so these talks will probably fail quite quickly. So what does Donald Trump do when he has a triple loss of face, right? Loss of face on tariffs, loss of face on Russia and Ukraine, because that didn't go according to plan. The Nobel Peace Prize, heaven forfend, looks like something that's disappearing into your rearview mirror, right? And then you've got the Iran thing going on.
Wag the dog.
Final two questions.
Yes, sorry.
One there and one
There's one at the back.
Yeah.
A man waving vigorously.
Sorry, we've got one before them.
There we go.
Take them two at a time, yeah?
Yes, two at the time.
It's ready. Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. So my question is, what do you think are the deeper issues that led to Trump's rise? What kind of values or perceptions and the worldviews have resonated so strongly with his supporters you have elected him, and why? Thank you.
Okay.
I'll hazard.
Okay, sorry.
Two questions at the same
The other
okay.
question, you did not mention Elon Musk, and I wanted to ask you about this AI, so all this general intelligence that could rapture any time from now and change everything we know as human beings. How do you think this could add, and can you explain, is this new that you have all the CEOs of the big tech corporates at the inauguration? What that means? What do you think they know that we don't?
Conspiracy, but well, Trump seems to have the kind of perverse genius of knowing what makes people angry. I think he understood, I think he's always been a bigot, and he understood that if you, and all societies have their buried resentments, whether they're sectarian or racial or economic, but if you, and you call it a scab, and if you pick at it hard enough, you can get to the flesh underneath. And that's what he did. When he came down that golden elevator in 2015 and talked about the Mexicans being thieves and rapists and murderers, he was opening up his first line of offense. He was playing to people's submerged bigotry and racism, and he worked it. He realized he had a chord there, and it became his drum that he beat. Now, before that, by the way, immigration was not a #1 issue in the United States. It was not, most newspapers and magazines did not have border or immigration correspondents, for that matter, television stations either. He's made it one. He's effectively made it an issue. Build it and they will come. And of course, by repeatedly banging the drum about the border, I also believe more people came. Yeah. The caravans certainly were organized as a result of Trump's, clarion calls. Anyway, so that's my kind of hazarded response to what Trump has appealed to, is this idea of a reaction against, and now we're seeing it with this DEI business. We're seeing, this is why I was thinking about Iran and the Basij, because it's this idea of a revolution against the elites, against the aristocracy, against the intellectuals. Why would you go after the Kennedy Center and the Smithsonian and Harvard? And we know that most of the people that voted for him, classic, it was white men without a college education, young men, right? So there's that. Actually, and on to Musk. We did mention Musk. And in fact, Musk is a very important adjunct of his in the country I was just reporting on in Brazil. Musk has been a key partner to the kind of advance of Trumpism via X and the spread of hate speech and fake news in the elections in these various countries. And that's one of the reasons for this standoff. So in most of the world, of course, he's getting his way, but in certain countries, it's kind of running aground. To the extent, for instance, that Lula said that they're also going to be they're looking for an alternative to Starlink. They don't want to have, just like some people are no longer buying Teslas and some are even burning them. In the case of Brazil, if they can, they will not continue with Starlink, his satellite system.
Yeah.
So as for AI, Jesus, I haven't a clue. It's a bit like talking about what's the end game for Trump.
Yeah.
We don't know. We didn't even know about AI until about a year ago, right? So it's new.
I would just
Maybe
say
you have more.
I would just say one thing
thoughts
very
about it.
briefly to wrap it up because we're getting late. Trump is really good at telling stories. He's a storyteller. They're obnoxious stories, they're toxic stories, but he tells a story with images. I'm going to build a wall and Mexico will pay for it. There's no wall, there's a fence, and he didn't build much of it. He's very good at telling their stories. The Democrats have to be better at telling stories. Just like the Brexit crowd were very good at telling stories, the other side were not good at telling stories. So to the opposition, I would say, before you mount the barricades, and you tool up for something really serious, find some good stories to tell. And, it's good if they're true, but the other guy's telling stories that aren't true, and he's getting away with it. Find something compelling, something that taps into the American spirit, something that's perhaps a little, America, I don't know, I lived there for 11 years. Americans like to feel good about themselves.
Yeah.
And they're not at the moment. Rage is not the American default, mental state. And I thought we'd broken that fever, and we obviously didn't. But maybe Trump is doing his best to undermine it. So anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. Thank you all.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Pramvira.